I turned on my microphone, sorry guys. So we're going to talk about elections, and it's timely, of course, because we have an election in less than 3 weeks. Early voting has already started, and in some places people are waiting in line as long as 11 hours to early vote. We've seen a record number of early voting, about 15 million people already. So this is quite the interesting election we're heading into. A lot of people may choose to vote early as opposed to waiting for election day. We're going to talk about primaries, caucuses, a bit about campaigning, debates, and so on. Okay. We hold our presidential election every 4 years on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. Why that is the case, I do not know. Logically, maybe because it's the end of harvest season, so it made sense in the 1800s. But we hold our presidential election every 4 years on the first Tuesday in November. Midterm elections, where we re-elect the entire House of Representatives and a third of the Senate, are held every 2 years on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. Of course, we have to pick our candidates, right? We have to choose who's going to run for mayor, city council, school board, state senate, national senate, and so on. This is where we have our primaries, where we pick who's going to nominate the Democrats or the Republicans in November. This year there were at one point almost 20 Democrats running for president, and then it got narrowed down to candidates like Pete Buttigieg, Joe Biden, and Bernie Sanders, and then it got narrowed down after that. Then the general election chooses who wins that seat. Is it the Democrat or the Republican? And of course, there are third-party candidates who occasionally win, but they're not usually viable. And each state has to decide if it does an open or a closed primary. In a closed primary, you have to be a registered member of one of the two parties to participate. In Florida, for example, you have to register as a Democrat or a Republican to take part in the primaries. In an open primary, you are not required to register with a party. You can simply choose which party's primary you want to take part in. So open primaries give independents a chance to participate in the election process. Here in Texas, we have what's called a semi-open primary. You don't have to register with a party to vote. But if you voted Democrat in this year's primary, you can only participate in Democratic Party activities until the end of the year. So you could only participate in the Democratic State Convention, Democratic runoffs, and so on. And the same if you voted Republican. It's a temporary party affiliation, and you can always switch it the next time around. It's not permanent, but it's not completely open either. You basically have to pick a party and stick with them for party activities until the end of the year. The biggest advantage of not requiring people to register with a party is less chance of potential voter suppression. In Florida, it's a bit of a problem if you're a Democrat a Republican-controlled area or vice versa. There may be attempts to kind of minimize the vote of the opposition. Right. So how do candidates win? Right? How is it that they win their primaries for their general elections? We do have what's called a plurality system. You do not need to get the majority of the vote to win. You just have to get the most votes. So you can get 40% of the vote and be the winner because you got the most votes total. So it's not a majority system. The winner does not have to get 50 or 51% to be victor. They just have to get the most votes. This is problematic, and there's a lot of candidates running. And we saw this happening in 2016. There were so many candidates running that Trump got the nomination because he got the most votes. He only got about 35% of the vote in most states. Because there were so many candidates running, he got the most votes and he became the nominee. So the more candidates you have running, the less likely it is that the candidate will have been chosen by the majority of Democrats or Republicans. So people who weren't happy about Trump winning the nomination in 2016, there were just too many candidates running, and he was the last man standing. We also see straight ticket versus split ticket voting. Straight ticket voting is where someone walks in on election day and pushes the button or fills in the hole that says vote straight Republican, vote straight Democrat. Then they're recorded as having voted for all the Democratic candidates on the ballot or all the Republican candidates. People who are pretty die-hard party members do tend to vote straight ticket. Independents, moderates tend to vote split ticket. Maybe they vote for Joe Biden for president, but then John Cornyn for Senate. They'll go back and forth between the candidates. They may vote Democrat, and then Libertarian, and then Republican, and so on. So split ticket voting is common for people who don't necessarily vote on a regular basis, and people who vote based on the candidate's issues, not their party affiliation. And of course, there's oftentimes problems with the ballot. In parts of Florida, they still use a paper ballot. In 2018, they ran out of ballots and one precinct and had to wait until they could print some more. Because if you make a mistake on a paper ballot, you have to toss it out and get a new one. So they were running out of ballots. There can also be issues with electronic voting. Sometimes the machines don't quite work properly. In 2018, in some parts of Texas, there was an issue where some kind of coding error in the machines was making it so if you voted straight Democrat, somehow you were voting for Ted Cruz instead of Beto O'Rourke. That's a problem, right? You can't have that happening. The most famous example is the 2000 election with the infamous Florida butterfly ballot. And I'm going to show you this insanely bizarre ballot. I like to call this the designed by drunken otters on payday ballot, because in no way, shape, or form does this make any kind of sense. Right? If you're looking at it, okay, that's how you vote Republican. People were getting confused and thought this meant Democrat, but it actually meant Reform Party. So you had Democrats voting for Pat Buchanan, and they meant to vote for Al Gore. Right? That's a problem. Also, you had to punch all the way through for your vote to count. People were only partly punching the ballot. But then they had to recount the votes. as a partial punch count. Photos of election people holding up the ballots trying to see if they count or not. But Buchanan himself said, I know this many people didn't vote for me. This was obviously a problem. He went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, we're counting the rehaul, we're stopping the recount, and we're giving Florida to Governor Bush. Whether or not he actually won, we may never know. But this was problematic, to say the least. They did ditch it in the next election, but of course that's too little too late on that particular ballot. The other problem we see is if we use voting machines, what is the potential for hacking, right? They had a convention where they invited hackers across the country to try and test a new machine. I think she was a 14 or 15-year-old girl hacks the election results in a machine in under 3 hours. Obviously don't want that happening either, right? So how do we guarantee that the election results are fair? There's no 100% guarantee. We just have to trust that the system will work. It's scary sometimes. Okay, any questions or comments on that?
In regards to voting right now, I heard that some places are doing roadside voting. How would that work?
Yeah, usually that they would bring the ballot out to your car, or they could have it on a tablet if it's virtual, and then you would fill it out, and then it would be submitted. So either they bring it out to you, you fill it out, and take it back inside. They have a tablet, and they can fill it out there. And that's helpful for people who are immunocompromised, can't go inside, but yeah, that's how they're doing it. All right, so we do tend to see some issues with the way our districts have been created. Every 10 years, when we have the census data, there are changes in terms of who gets new districts, who gets districts taken away, and so on. Texas, because our population has increased, we may get 2 or 3 new congressional districts. When that happens, the state legislature will draw up the districts. Now, they are supposed to be roughly equal in size in terms of population. Should be. Not always the case. And in the Baker case, it became clear that some states are not redistricting in a way that was fair. Texas was setting up districts that clearly favored, at the time, white Democrats. So the Supreme Court has said if there is a problem with redistricting, it can be taken up by the federal courts, and then the legislature may have to redraw the map. The average House district has 700,000 people in it. That's a lot of people for one representative. How do you meet the needs of 700,000 people? It's tricky. And of course, there's always problems with gerrymandering. The majority party in the state legislature creates the districts. They try to draw them up in a way that's fair to their party. In Illinois, the Democrats try to build an advantage for them. In Texas, the Republicans do. So it's not a fair, impartial process. It's very, very partisan. The creation of some of these districts, it's quite frankly more than a little ridiculous. Our district stretches for the state senate across to Laredo. That just doesn't make any sense. I mean, in no sense of the words, Laredo geographically close to where we are. And so what happens with this is it means that 96% of incumbents tend to get reelected, because there's no competition. If you're a Democrat in Chicago, you're pretty much guaranteed to win. If you're a Republican in Alabama, you're pretty much guaranteed to win because districts are set up in such a way that your party is guaranteed to win every single time. And there's also issues with the packing of minorities into districts. Sometimes the state legislature will get it into their head that they should dilute the minority vote. So what they'll do is they'll take African Americans, Hispanic Latinos, and they'll pack them into one district so that they aren't causing problems for the ruling party in other districts. Now this is not allowed. By and large, if a district is created simply to pack minorities into it, that's a problem. If it so happens that the majority of the population is Hispanic or African American, and that's just the way it falls, fine. But you can't deliberately pack all of the minorities into one district and say, good enough. So unfortunately, our elections just aren't as competitive as they should be because partisan politics play a role in who gets put into what district. When I was in college, the district I belonged to, the Illinois 17, but all the way down, and part of the district was, went through a golf course in the state capitol. I mean, it was so weird the way they drew up that district. It didn't make any sense. Okay, so in terms of the presidential primaries and caucuses, which we saw earlier this year, the Iowa caucus is first. Usually it's a fairly smooth process. This year, of course, was the exception, but usually meet up in a school, a hospital, a library, a church, and you divide into groups. This many people for Joe Biden, this many people for Pete Buttigieg, this many people for Bernie Sanders. And then they count. And then the candidates who aren't considered viable, their people are free to move to another group, and then they recount until they're done. Obviously, this year they were trying to use an app that didn't work, and essentially it was a tie between Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders. No real clear winner. The New Hampshire primary follows after the Iowa caucus. So they have the biggest influence on who the candidates are going to be. If a candidate wins or does better than expected in these two states, they'll get more public support, more media coverage. Pete Buttigieg essentially tying with Bernie Sanders in Iowa, the campaign got a lot more attention after that. A lot more people were looking at him as a possibly viable candidate. On the other hand, if a candidate does worse than expected in these two races, there's a lot of pressure to drop out, which doesn't make a lot of sense, right? We've only had 2 elections, and yet a candidate's expected to drop out if they don't do well in 2 out of 50 primaries. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. So because Iowa and New Hampshire are so influential, we've seen a lot of states moving their primaries earlier and earlier in the calendar so they can have a say in who the nominee is going to be. In 2016, 13 states in American Samoa held their primaries on the same day. This year, Texas and California moved their primaries to Super Tuesday, so it was something like 15 states this time around. So Super Tuesday has now become the make or break point for a candidate. If you can't win 3 or 4 out of the 15 states, it's time to drop out. So Super Tuesday can separate who's going to win versus who isn't. After Super Tuesday this year, we had two candidates left, Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. Everyone else was gone. So Super Tuesday now really decides who the nominee is going to be. That's the first Tuesday in March. So it still leaves the states later in the calendar out of the discussion. And then you also have to pick who's going to the national convention. You have to pick the delegates who will vote on behalf of the state. So let's say on Super Tuesday you voted for Bernie Sanders. You weren't voting directly for Bernie Sanders. You were voting for the delegates from Texas to vote for him at the national convention. So basically what you're doing is picking representatives to vote for your candidate on behalf of Texas at the national convention. So when we can have an actual convention, they will do it by state, and someone from Texas will stand up and say, Texas votes this many votes for Joe Biden, this many votes for Bernie Sanders, and then they count them all up. So again, you're not voting directly for the candidate necessarily, you're voting for the person to vote for that candidate at the convention. Which I realize is about as clear as mud, but there you go.
Then we're gonna have an instance where the majority voted for one, but the rest decided to vote the other on his own term.
It's rare. It can happen. Usually that doesn't happen because the delegates make a pledge to vote the way that the state voted. This really only becomes important if it's a brokered convention. So if no candidate has enough delegates to be the nominee outright, that's when you see the kind of politicking. So usually they'll say, okay, Joe Biden won the majority of the vote in Texas, so the majority of our delegates are pledged to Joe Biden, and they can't switch to Bernie Sanders at the last minute. So usually the delegates run based on the candidate they want to represent. So they'll say, I'm a Bernie Sanders delegate or a Joe Biden delegate. So they make it clear from the beginning how they're going to vote. No, good question. All right, so the conventions are held every 4 years. Originally, the candidates were chosen by the party elites at the convention. Up until about World War II, the way it would work is Democrats would meet, Republicans would meet. People at the top of the party would say, Harry Truman is our nominee, and then they would tell the Democratic voters, here's your nominee, go vote for this person. Now, of course, there's primaries and caucuses. Usually, a candidate has enough delegates to be the nominee prior to the convention. If no candidate has enough delegates, then there has to be a vote. And there has to be negotiating, horse trading, discussions. So the last time this really happened was in 1968, when Bobby Kennedy, who would have been the party's nominee, was murdered on the night of the California primary. Now your party's lead candidate is dead, and you've got two other candidates fighting it out to be the nominee. So it turned into a very ugly floor fight. Humphrey eventually won, but it wasn't a process. Usually we know who it is prior to the convention. Now there have been times where it is a bit controversial. In 2016 it was really not good, because what ended up happening was it was very close between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. And Hillary Clinton got the nomination because of superdelegates. Superdelegates are party elites who can vote for whomever they want. They're not bound to vote the way their state does. So basically, she got the nomination not because of the voters, but because of the party elite. And there was a lot of pushback from Democrats saying she didn't actually win, right? The party gave it to her. There were a lot of very frustrated Bernie Sanders supporters going, I don't know if I can vote for her because she didn't really outright win the nomination. The most important parts of the convention are the president and vice presidential nominees giving their speeches, talking about the issues, appealing to voters, talking about their history, their connections with the voters. This year, of course, it was a little different because they had to do it virtually, but it gives voters a chance to see how these candidates interact with the public. It gives them a chance to know the history of the candidates. Their spouses will often give a speech before they come out, talking about, here's what we're going to do to make life better for you. It's a way for the voters to look at the candidates and say, how do I feel about them? Do I like this candidate or not? Do I agree with their VP choice or not? Nowadays, the conventions, most of the coverage at a convention is usually the keynote speakers and then the presidential and vice presidential nominees. A lot of the floor action just isn't considered interesting anymore, so it's not really covered in the convention by the networks. All right, and now we get to the controversial, difficult to understand, and why the hell does this exist institution known as the Electoral College. This is what often trips people up. We do not directly vote for the president. What we do is we vote for electors from both parties to vote for our candidate at the Electoral College in December. So if you vote for Donald Trump, you're not voting for him. You're voting for Texas Republicans to vote for him at the Electoral College, and same with the Democratic candidate. We're not actually directly electing the president. We're electing the people who elect the president. And the number of delegates a state is given for the Electoral College is dependent on size. California has 55 Electoral College votes, North Dakota 3. Where's the candidate going to spend his time? California. Right? California, Texas, Florida, New York. So there are 538 Electoral College members. They represent the 435 House members, 100 senators, 3 votes for the District of Columbia. For a candidate to win the Electoral College, they have to get 270 out of 538. This can cause problems when the winner of the popular vote is not president. And this is problematic when you don't have to get the majority of the votes to win the Electoral College for that state. So in Florida, for example, Donald Trump only got 49% of the popular vote, but he got all 29 of the state's Electoral College votes. So he won the Electoral College, not the popular vote. And this has happened 4 times in our history. 1876, 1888, in 2000 with Gore Bush, and then 2016 with Clinton Trump. It's rare that this happens, but it does. And it frustrates the voters because they look at that and say, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 3 million, she's not president. So voters get frustrated with this, and they want some changes to the Electoral College. One proposed change is let's just get rid of it altogether. Another one says to tie the Electoral College to the popular vote. And the third is allowing for a splitting of the electors, right? Trump only got 49% of the vote in Florida. Could he have gotten all 29 delegates? Probably not, right? They could have split that in half and given him 15 and maybe Hillary Clinton 14, right? Find a way to make it a little bit closer to the popular vote. So the Electoral College was a compromise between founders who wanted the president elected by Congress and those who wanted a direct election. So it's one of those difficult to understand things that people tend to forget, because usually the winner of the popular vote is the winner of the Electoral College, so this doesn't necessarily come into play. Any questions on that? I know it's clear as mud, right? But that's how we elect the president. Okay. Now, we do directly elect the House and the Senate, and there are direct democracy elections on things like constitutional amendments, ballot initiatives, and so on. So it helps if we can directly vote on state constitutional amendment. Here in Texas, the state legislature proposes a constitutional amendment and we vote on it. That's direct democracy. We pick what goes into our Constitution. In some states, they use a ballot initiative. In some states, voters can get something put on the ballot by collecting a certain percentage of signatures. Let's say you need 5% of registered voters to get medical marijuana on the ballot. If you get that in Florida, for example, then it gets onto the ballot. In 2016, there were 163 ballot measures in 35 states. People may not necessarily care who's their senator, but they do care about things like the death penalty, minimum wage, medical marijuana, abortion, and so on. We do tend to see higher voter turnout in elections where there are ballot measures in that particular election. So ballot measures on things like same-sex marriage prior to Obergefell would increase Republican turnout. Measures on things like raising the minimum wage tend to increase Democrat turnout. Medical marijuana, usually there's a pretty decent level of support by both Democrats and Republicans, depending. In Florida, tried to legalize medical marijuana, they had to do it twice. The first time in 2014, it got something like 52% of the vote, but it turned out it needed to get 60%. It was put back on the ballot in 2016, and then it was confirmed. They got medical marijuana. This can be a way to get voters to show up. There are some issues that they care quite a bit about. In terms of getting rid of state officials, there are what's known as recall elections. If the voters are really unhappy with the governor, they can choose to kick them out of office prior to their term expiring. This happened to Governor Gray Davis in California in 2003. The state had a huge budget deficit, and the governor was criticized for not doing enough to deal with it. So he was kicked out of office, and Arnold Schwarzenegger won in the runoff election. Scott Walker, there were 2 attempts to recall him. The first one didn't get onto the ballot, the second one he survived. So if you're really unhappy with what the candidates are doing, you can choose to kick them out of office. You can say, you're not doing your job as governor, things are not going well, it's time for you to go. That's also a form of direct democracy. Right. So there's a lot of steps for how you deal with campaigning. Once you've become the nominee, you have to get people to vote for you. So campaign is essentially the effort you make to get people to donate money, time, and of course, vote for you. It's easier if you are the incumbent. You already have the name recognition and the donors. It's harder if you're the challenger. We've seen presidential campaigns beginning almost 2 years before the election. In November, December of 2018, we saw the Democratic candidates announcing they were running for president. They do that because they need to get money to fund their campaign even before the first primaries and caucuses. The incumbent does have a built-in advantage, and they don't have to campaign quite as hard. You have to hire people to help with your campaign. You need an advisor, you need campaign managers, media people, financial advisors, how much money do we have, how much money do we need, and coordinators in all of the states. You need people running your field offices in Texas or Oklahoma or New York. There's a lot of personnel that goes into campaigns, especially presidential campaigns. You're going to need people to handle the money, people to be a surrogate and go and talk to the press. Someone to make sure you don't say something utterly and completely stupid. For example, Lindsey Graham was in a Senate debate recently, and he actually said, I can't believe he did this, he said that Black people in South Carolina are free to go anywhere they want as long as they're conservative. Not something you should be saying on national television. Pretty sure his campaign manager wanted to smack him upside the head after that because you don't say something like that, right? That's why you have people to keep you from saying something that idiotic. But he did. We do have to spend a lot of money. Competitive house races, we're talking 10 to 20 million. I think so. Yeah. Yeah. And it was even, it would be bad enough in any election, but it happens that his opponent is African American. So he's on the stage with a Black Democrat, and he's basically telling him, if you were a conservative, you'd be fine. Like, but he still may win re-election, so there you go. But yeah, he said some things like, why isn't your campaign manager just put a muffle on you already? Just like, no more. Lord. Presidential campaigns, $4 billion was spent between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama in 2012. That's more than some countries make in a year. And we're talking obscene amounts of money going into elections. to have a strategy of some kind. It's rare for a presidential candidate to have a 50-state strategy. It's too expensive and time-consuming. Now, Obama did that in 2008, but it's very, very taxing on the candidate. If you have to visit 4 states in one day, you're going to be pretty damn exhausted. So they tend to focus on certain areas. Now, there's going to be volunteers that they need to go door to door, phone bank, show up at rallies, post signs, and so on. Usually, this election is going to be an exception. Usually, they love having college students volunteer. They'll give you free campaign stuff, they'll feed you. They love it when college students show up to volunteer. Obviously, this year it's a bit different, but usually in an election year, especially presidential, they very much like it when college students show up to volunteer. Candidates also make sure they show up in public. Every candidate goes to the Iowa State Fair the year before the caucus. It's basically a way of declaring that you are a viable candidate. They also go to this diner in New Hampshire where they eat a piece of pie and talk to the voters. It's kind of cheesy, but it looks good, right? They get to speak to the voters. They'll go to colleges. They'll go to city halls, right? They'll show up and talk to the voters. On the local level, it tends to be more of a grassroots, folksy outreach. You're much more likely to see your congressional candidate out in the field than a presidential candidate. Much more local funding, like barbecues and stuff like that. For presidential campaigns, it's a lot more media-driven, polished appearances, controlled scheduling, that kind of thing. You don't necessarily see a presidential candidate at a backyard barbecue. It's not impossible, it's just, it doesn't happen that often. The candidates do tend to focus on the battleground states. And this is where you have roughly equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans. The key battleground states are Iowa, New Hampshire, Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan a bit this year, although not usually. They're going to spend a lot of time and a lot of money in these states. They're going to go to Florida repeatedly, Iowa repeatedly, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania. Basically, they're going to get sick of these people by the end of the election because they're going to spend so much time and money there. Now, of course, we see a heavy use of digital and social media. There are campaign ads on television, of course, but you're more likely to see an ad on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook. Less reliance on broadcast media and more on social media, news apps, and so on. We are seeing a shift in strategy away from traditional media and more towards social media. I think both Biden and Trump have been in Florida recently trying to get out the vote. Right, so obviously the media can be beneficial or harmful to a candidate. Candidates do sometimes engage in a town hall meeting. It's a little bit less formal. They get to sit down, take off their jackets, maybe roll up their sleeves a little bit, talk directly to the voters. Usually, at least one of the presidential debates is a town meeting, because it gives the voters a chance to see how does someone interact with the public one-on-one. Do they come off as sympathetic? The town hall debate is essentially what killed President George H.W. Bush in 1992. During the debate, he kept looking at his watch, he looked irritated, confused, he didn't seem pathetic. Whereas Bill Clinton was talking directly to the audience, looking in their eyes, I'm Bill Clinton, I'm here to help you. And so that helps them out, right? If they come across as more personable, sympathetic, understanding, that can be helpful. And if they come across as genuine versus staged. And of course, we have the role of television ads. And usually, I show one of the most famous negative ads in history, but given the limitations of our technology, I'll just tell you about it. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson was running for president, and he released an ad that showed a little girl plucking the petals off of a daisy and counting down, and then a voice comes over and basically finishes the countdown, and the nuclear bomb goes off. And it talks about the stakes of the election. It ran once, and only once. And after that, everyone was outraged, horrified, and yet they remembered the ad. Why? It has more of a psychological impact on us. We feel scared. We feel angry. We don't like negative ads, but they work. The candidates continue to use them because people remember them more. It's unfortunate, but it does happen. And by today's standards, the Daisy ad is considered pretty tame. In 1964, big controversy. Now, negative ads can backfire if they are blatantly false. Like if someone runs an ad saying Joe Biden wants to kill all babies, obviously that's not even true, right? There's no truth in that whatsoever. We do tend to remember the negative ones. Psychologically, they just stick with us more. So if a candidate runs an all-positive campaign, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to win. We may not like negative ads, but we do remember them. And of course, we do have to take into consideration how the media covers a candidate. When Trump clinched the nomination after the Mississippi primary, CNN, Fox, and MSNBC aired 45 uninterrupted minutes of his speech. When Hillary Clinton won the nomination, there was no coverage. Now, to be fair, no one expected Donald Trump to get the nomination, so it was a big deal. The media had already said from the beginning Hillary Clinton was going to be the nominee, so they figured, I even cover it. It's not. But it does make a difference, right? If you're showing 45 minutes of one candidate's speech and none of the other, that's a little problematic. You got to at least show the other candidate giving their victory speech. Also in 2004, there was an infamous incident with Governor of Vermont, Howard Dean. He placed third in the Iowa caucus, and he was talking to his supporters, and he gave this speech, and he let out a giant scream at the end of it. And the media just ran with it, and ran with it, and ran with it. It became this huge joke. That was basically the end of his campaign. One moment where he just let loose, and that was it. That was the end of it for him. So candidates do have to be careful because sometimes that image just absolutely kills them. Also, don't ever challenge the media. In 1988, I believe it was, there's a candidate running named Gary Hart, and rumors were spreading that he was having an affair. And so he told the media, well, prove it. And the media started following him around and then caught him heading out onto his yacht with his mistress and filmed it. Don't ever challenge the media if you're a candidate you don't want to see what happens. That was pretty much the end of his campaign. Don't get that stupid. Don't ever challenge the media. Okay. Another critical factor can be debates, right? And debates give us a chance to see how the candidates do in a face-to-face exchange. Although lately the debates are more like a boxing match, and honestly, I'm still waiting for Joe Biden or Donald Trump to try the other one, because honestly, that first debate was just nuts. I mean, they're usually not that bad, right? Oh, they're usually not that ugly. They can get heated, but they're not usually that freaking ugly. It's a good way for the candidates to show off their skills. Can they think on their feet? Can they manage their emotions? Okay, not this election, obviously, it's the managing of emotions, but usually we'd like to see them keep their emotions under control. So Obama was a very skilled debater, right? And that did help him in both elections. He came off very, very skilled. And the first televised debates in history were in 1960. And it was interesting because there were two opinions on the outcome of the debate. The people who listened to the debate on radio said Nixon did a better job. The people who watched the debate said Kennedy did a better job. Because at the time, Nixon was getting over a bout of the flu. He had a 5 o'clock shadow, dark circles, he looked ill, he looked 20 years older than Kennedy, who looked young, presidential, and handsome. And people look at that and they're like, he looks better than Nixon. Now, should that make a difference? No. Does it? Absolutely. Right? This is why candidates now pay attention to what they're wearing, how they look, making sure they're well rested. They're not looking like something the cat dragged in. And it's also challenging for female candidates because then there's all these questions. Why does Hillary Clinton always wear pantsuits? What's the meaning of this color, etc., etc., etc. And so the debates can reveal a strength and a weakness. One of the worst moments for a candidate in a debate came in 1988. The Democratic nominee was the then governor of Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis. He was asked in a debate, if his wife was raped and murdered, would he favor the death penalty? Because he was on record as opposing. And man, oh man, did he watch the question. He was like, well, it's important to understand that he gave this very robotic answer that made it sound like he didn't care if his wife was raped and murdered. Like, it just came across as uncaring, unfeeling. In his defense, he didn't realize they were going to ask him the question. That pretty much killed his campaign. And he came across as seeming like he didn't give a damn that his wife would be murdered. That was the end of it. Usually, a candidate's rude and aggressive, that doesn't help. People weren't happy with the first debate that we saw, but I don't know if it really changed a lot of people's minds. And it was a strategy that the Trump campaign chose to use, for better or worse. So whether or not it actually worked, we can't say. Most people were just irritated with the debate and didn't really seem to think that either side actually won. They were just annoyed with what they saw on stage. The vice presidential debate was a bit better, but it still wasn't very great. Candidates, of course, realize that there's people who may be on the fence about them. So they'll try to reach out to voters that may not quite know how they're feeling. George W. Bush knew that conservative Republicans wouldn't necessarily agree with his economic stance. So he would appeal to them on abortion and same-sex marriage and say, look, I get that you don't necessarily necessarily agree with me on the economy, but you know that I'm pro-life. You know that I oppose same-sex marriage. Can't you at least get behind me on these issues? And that did work for him. He got evangelicals to vote for him by focusing on abortion and same-sex marriage. Barack Obama decided to use surveys. He used a very methodical tool by doing thousands of short and long form interviews. He would talk to voters and they would say, what do you think are his strengths? What do you think are his weaknesses? What do you need to hear more from him? And so they get responses like, well, I don't fully understand his stance on healthcare. And then he would talk about it and try to clarify that. Well, he seems a little weak on defense. Okay, then he would try to talk about that, right? Trying to get voters to join him. And it worked, right? He won both elections pretty well. You will see the candidates using targeted groups. Undecided or weakly committed voters are always up for grabs. So Trump is trying to appeal to them on the economy. Biden's trying to appeal to them on healthcare, COVID-19 response, and issues of race. So they're trying to reach those voters who haven't made up their mind yet, hoping that they'll get them to vote for them. We do see candidates using direct mailings, more so at the local level, judicial campaigns, city council, sometimes Senate, usually like state offices. You'll get a flyer saying, this judge stands for military spending, or this judge favors harsher penalties, things like that they think people will remember when it comes time to vote for them. So this candidate is a law and order candidate. This candidate favors medical marijuana. Okay, so now I have incentive to vote for this candidate or this candidate. There's a lot of strategy that goes into campaigning. There's a lot of agonizing decisions. Where do we spend money? Can we afford to spend more money here? What happens if the candidate says something stupid, right? How do you fix that? What happens when you run out of money? How does that come into play? Money can be the big factor in who wins. If neither candidate has enough money to do a huge ad buy, that's a problem. They have to be able to raise the money to keep going. Joe Biden got something like $350 million after the first debate from voters who wanted to contribute to his campaign. That did benefit him. So he has a little bit more money heading into the final stretch. There's a lot of different components that go into a campaign that help us decide how we're going to vote. Especially for independents who maybe haven't quite made up their mind yet. So campaigns are critical in elections, even though sometimes it feels like they go on forever. Any questions? Comments? Are you guys ready for this election to be over? Yeah, I think we're done with it already. Yeah. And the sad thing is, I mean, anymore it's like, once the election's over, it's still not really over. They're still campaigning, they're still politicking, they don't even really get a chance to breathe very much. Okay, so just as a reminder, tonight there are competing town hall meetings. Both of them start at 7 p.m. our time. Biden's will be on ABC, President Trump's will be on NBC. If you watch either one of them, obviously you can't watch both at the same time, but if you watch either one of them and write something up for me, that will count for extra credit, if there's no debate. Okay, we'll wrap up elections next week by talking about specific elections. So read the second half of Chapter 10 for Tuesday. And if you came in after I took attendance, come see me for a minute. Otherwise, I'll see you guys